How are you tonight, Aaron?
I'm doing okay. How are you, Elahe?
I'm doing good. We just watched the vice presidential debate, and as I was watching them debate, I was trying to imagine what was the pump-up song that each of them listened to before they took the debate stage? Like, what song did they listen to hype themselves up? And then it made me ask myself, what would Aaron's pump-up song be if he had to go debate someone? What would you listen to?
I have this mix of this is going to surprise some people, but I have a mix of very angry 90s hip hop that I listen to when I'm working out in the gym.
Give me a title. First one that comes to
uh,
mind.
I don't even know if I can say this on a Washington Post podcast, but Hit 'Em Up by Tupac is on there. Like literally like the angriest 90s hip hop that I can think of. And I made this playlist and it's like, yeah.
Aaron Blake, you and I are kindred spirits because I too have a 90s hip hop hype song and it is a Wu-Tang song. So
here we go.
We're going to have to debate each other.
Is it Cream or what is it?
Triumph, because I'm going to triumph in the debate.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I should add that to the playlist, actually.
Yeah, totally. Welcome to the campaign moment on this very early morning on Wednesday, October 2nd. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter.
Just a heads up to our listeners, the audio of our conversation might sound a little different than what you're used to because we're recording this late and we ran into some tech issues, but we've got it resolved. And anyway, Aaron, I'm so glad to be talking to you now.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. So, Elahe, this was the first and only vice presidential debate of the 2024 cycle. At least we think it's going to be the only one. Probably the last debate period. It was between Democratic candidate and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and the Republican candidate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. We're talking early Wednesday morning, so this info is nice and fresh in our heads. And we're going to run down some of the biggest moments from the debate, some of the biggest takeaways, and what it all might mean for the campaign ahead.
That's right. So, Aaron, vice presidential debates are not usually viewed as like earth-shattering moments, but when you and I talked on the show last week, you said you were just so excited for this debate. I think what you said was you might be the most excited person in the United States. Why were you so excited?
Yeah, I was maybe a little bit too excited. It was interesting. All debates are interesting, and I would never speak ill of a presidential or vice presidential debate because I think they're so valuable and they're just an important part of this process. But it was kind of a far cry from the presidential debates that we saw before, where they seemed to really kind of change the ground underneath the race, and one candidate won by a lot, and there were lots of really big moments. This was a very kind of standard issue, respectful, even at times agreeing debate between these two candidates. And I think in a lot of ways reflected a pretty cautious approach by the two campaigns.
Yeah, that really stood out to me. It almost felt like I was watching an old school debate where these two candidates were actually being civil with each other. I mean, there were moments where they were just talking about how much they agreed with one another. Let's actually listen to a little bit of that tape.
I agree with a lot of what Senator Vance said about what's happening. His running mate, though, does not.
That, first of all, Governor, I agree with you. Amber Thurman should still be alive.
I agree with that.
Tim just said something that I agree with. We don't want to blame immigrants.
I agree. It should not take 7 years for an asylum claim to be done.
Aaron, what do you make of the tone of this debate and how they just spoke to each other?
I mean, it was like the 2000 era, I think it was.
Oh my gosh, you can
SNL
remember that far back.
Well, I don't remember, but I remember watching replays of the SNL sketches of the debates between George W. Bush and Al Gore, and the whole conceit of one of those sketches was like them just saying, I agree, over and over again. It was kind of a takeoff on how this debate featured not a whole lot of differences between the two candidates. There were differences between the two candidates in this debate, but it was remarkable the level of agreement and kind of sympathy between the two of them, and saying, Tim Walz repeatedly saying, I think that JD, cares about this issue and wants to, get this in the right place, but that's different than Donald Trump. It was almost like he was trying to pit Donald Trump against J.D. Vance. But in the course of that, he was kind of legitimizing a running mate in J.D. Vance who has been very unpopular for Donald Trump. And I also think just more broadly, like these candidates didn't want to, make too much news in here. They wanted to kind of show that they were competent, that they could answer these questions. They wanted to delve into the substance, but neither of them seemed to be really going for a huge moment that people would be talking about for days and weeks after this debate. And I think that's what sets vice presidential debates apart from presidential debates. You can be more cautious if you want to, and I think both campaigns kind of reflected that approach in this debate.
So is that what you would say each of them needed to accomplish, that they just needed to be cautious, not make big news, but just be competent enough to pass muster?
Yeah, I think it's a big part of a vice presidential debate because the big question for these candidates who are not leading the ticket and are not who voters generally think about being as the one they're voting for is showing that you can take over the job if and when the unthinkable happens, if and when somebody has to step aside. And so there are different stakes in a debate like this. At the same time, we came into this debate with some interesting dynamics that maybe lent themselves to some more going after each other and focus on the VP candidates themselves than we saw in this debate. There just wasn't a whole lot of that in this debate, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about how each of them actually did. So this debate was in New York. It was moderated by CBS News' Norah O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan. I want to ask you, Aaron, how each candidate did. Let's start with J.D. Vance. How do you think he did tonight?
I think Vance did a lot of favors for himself in this debate. As I mentioned, he came into this as a pretty historically unpopular running mate. The most polls show his unfavorable rating is double digits higher than his favorable rating. So 46% of Americans don't like him and 35% do. And that's not a great position to be in. And so I think what the Trump campaign and what Vance decided to do in this debate was to present a very different picture of J.D. Vance than we've seen before. This was not the culture warrior that was running for Ohio Senate in 2022, trying to win that Republican primary, or even kind of the anti-Ukraine funding senator that we've seen in recent years. He kind of sounded a lot like a standard issue conservative Republican. And so, I think they made a calculated decision to try and soften some of the hard edges that people have seen in J.D. Vance and kind of try to move past some of the, childless cat lady type stuff that have been the focus of so much of his time on the campaign trail.
Yeah, and that being a reference to some past comments he made criticizing women who don't have children and whether they actually care about the future of the country.
Yeah, and also, J.D. Vance it's not just those comments were kind of symptomatic of J.D. Vance's approach to politics in recent years. He would go on these podcasts with, kind of fringe political figures and kind of riff on these cultural issues and say things that were kind of shocking even for a Republican these days. And the candidate that we saw on the debate stage on Tuesday night was just a far cry from that in a way that had to be calculated for the Trump campaign.
Yeah, one example of what you're talking about, Aaron, this sort of softer image of Vance, is how Vance responded to Walz when Walz was talking about how his son witnessed a shooting. He has a 17-year-old son. So let's listen to that.
Tim, first of all, I didn't know that your 17-year-old witnessed a shooting. And I'm sorry about that, and I hope that he's doing okay. So. Christ have mercy. It is awful.
I mean, that stood out to me, that he was just relating directly to Tim Walz on this and creating that moment of connection. Did that stand out to you?
Yeah, there was a clear premium on expressing empathy for not just kind of the Trump base voters, but voters more broadly. That was something that Vance kind of came back to over and over again. Again, I think in service of kind of softening the hard edges that a lot of people have interpreted around his candidacy.
And Aaron, what about Governor Tim Walz? How did he do during this debate?
Well, it was clearly more of a struggle for Governor Walz, and especially, I think, early in the debate. As
he seemed nervous.
He did seem nervous in a way that you don't often see from a politician. And I think he kind of got it together as the debate went on. But I also noticed in his performance that even when he was trying to bring up specific attacks on the Republican ticket on Vance and on Trump, he wasn't really explaining precisely what he was talking about in a way that would make it intelligible for viewers of the debate. He often kind of looked directly down after he finished answering a question. It just wasn't a very resounding performance from him.
Yeah, maybe one of those moments that really stood out to me was this moment when he was asked by the moderator about apparently false statements he had made previously about being in Hong Kong during the Tiananmen Square protests in Beijing in 1989. Let's listen to a little bit of that.
Look, I will be the first to tell you, I have poured my heart into my community. I've tried to do the best I can, but I've not been perfect. And I'm a knucklehead at times, but it's always been about that. Those same people elected me to Congress for 12 years.
I mean, what does that mean? I guess he said he called himself a knucklehead at times. I mean, how did you take that when you heard that?
Well, I have to say, as a Minnesotan, it's nice to hear somebody say knucklehead on a presidential debate stage.
Is that like a Minnesotan saying?
I don't know if it is, but I say it a lot, so maybe it is. Okay. I call my son a knucklehead all the time.
Oh gosh, well, we say knuckle sandwich where I'm from, but
no, that's a little bit different thing.
Yeah.
You know, this exchange, it wasn't just that comment. It was also, as this went on, you know, Walz kind of tried to suggest that maybe he got this wrong. But then Margaret Brennan, the moderator, pressed him again and basically challenged him to weigh in more directly on this. And Walz basically admitted that he had misspoken about this. And it wound up being a very lengthy and awkward moment for Walz, where he was, again, stumbling over his words in a way that gave this story a little bit more life than I think we otherwise would have seen.
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said.
Like anytime you see a candidate on stage clearly not wanting to say the thing and then being forced to more or less say it, that's not a good moment. And so I think that's a kind of a tough moment for him and maybe a little bit of an indictment of how the Harris campaign has handled these questions.
Mm-hmm. And I guess contrasting that with how Vance was asked about some past statements he's made, really critical statements of former President Donald Trump, comparing him to Hitler, but even newer things that have come to light that have been reported by the Post, that Vance's previous explanation of, oh, well, I've evolved on Trump because I liked his policies. Well, he was still criticizing him after he was president. But when Vance was asked about this, he didn't really hem and haw. He just said, you know, I changed my mind, and then he just moved on.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit easier of an answer for him, given it's one he's been, giving for a long time. It's not necessarily a question of honesty so much as a question of, changing your mind and having a very convenient political flip-flop over the years. And so this is something that's followed him for a long time. And I thought, Walz certainly tried to emphasize that. At other points in the debate, he was contrasting, who J.D. Vance used to be with who Trump is today, and basically suggesting that Vance is towing Trump's line. So I thought that was certainly something that was going to come up at this debate, but probably didn't wind up being a huge point of emphasis.
Mm-hmm. Aaron, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to dig more into what Vance and Walz said about the issues tonight, and also whether this debate will have an impact on the race. We'll be right back. Okay, Aaron, as we have said, this debate was in some ways cordial. It was also pretty heavy on the policy. These two candidates spent a lot of time elaborating on the policies and proposals put forward by their running mates. And predictably, they were defending them and saying this is what America needs. Like, I heard Vance talking about Trump's proposed tariffs and Walz talking about Harris's proposals on child tax credits and things for first-time home buyers. So there's a lot there to get into the weeds, but one exchange stood out to me, and that was when the candidates were talking about abortion. What stood out to you about how they talked about abortion?
Yeah, this was really one of these efforts by Vance to try and put a more empathetic face on himself and on the Republican ticket. And here's what he said.
I grew up in a working class family in a neighborhood where I knew a lot of young women who had unplanned pregnancies and decided to terminate those pregnancies because they feel like they didn't have any other options. And, one of them is actually very dear to me. And I know she's watching tonight, and I love you. And she told me something a couple years ago that she felt like if she hadn't had that abortion, that it would have destroyed her life because she was in an abusive relationship. And I think that what I take from that as a Republican who proudly wants to protect innocent life in this country, who proudly wants to protect the vulnerable, is that my party, we've got to do so much better of a job at earning the American people's trust back on this issue where they frankly just don't trust us. And I think that's one of the things that...
And this is something that Vance has said occasionally before, the idea that Republicans need to win back the American people's trust on abortion rights and women's rights. But, he went on to not really moderate himself actually on abortion. He talked mostly about the idea that Republicans need to emphasize other ways in which they are pro-life, So it was kind of tonally moderating the stance on abortion without actually getting into specifics. And actually, as the moderators move forward with this, they pointed out that Vance has in the past expressed support for a federal abortion ban. He's called himself 100% pro-life, and he kind of tried to talk around it and suggest that he was just calling for a minimum federal standard for abortion bans.
Yeah, and this was also an issue that it felt like, as Tim Walz was talking about, that he was kind of finding his footing and some confidence in talking about this, which reminded me of the presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump when abortion came up in that debate. We talked about how she kind of found her confidence and footing at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot easier of an issue to talk about if you're a Democrat right now. And it's been that way ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022. And so, you've seen Donald Trump struggle with this issue politically in recent months. He's took forever to take a position on the Florida abortion rights amendment, contrasting that with the 6-week ban that Florida has in place. He didn't take a position on that for many months before ultimately coming out against this ballot measure. And then Trump just says he's going to let states handle this issue without saying precisely what states should do. And I think all of it is just a reflection of taking any real specific positions on this issue is just so problematic for Republicans because their orthodoxy is so at odds with where the American public has come over the last couple of years. So I think J.D. Vance probably put a better face on this and talked about it more empathetically. But practically speaking, I'm not sure it says a whole lot about, the Republican Party actually moderating on these issues.
Mm-hmm. One other policy exchange moment that stood out to me was when the candidates were asked about healthcare and specifically the Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare. Here's Vance saying that Trump improved Obamacare.
When Obamacare was crushing under the weight of its own regulatory burden and healthcare costs, Donald Trump could have destroyed the program. Instead, he worked in a bipartisan way to ensure that Americans had access to affordable care.
I mean, this is pretty remarkable that we had a Republican vice presidential candidate going up on stage and basically talking about the good things about Obamacare. Like it was really remarkable. And I think there's going to be a lot of chewing over precisely what he meant about Trump improving and salvaging Obamacare. Like there were no huge healthcare overhauls during Trump's presidency. He tried to repeal and replace Obamacare unsuccessfully. But I think it really speaks to this idea that Vance wanted to present this more kind of mainstream, face than this ticket has really had for a long time.
Yeah, and it was interesting because Walz tried to, in the moment, push back on Vance on his sort of framing of Obamacare.
Yeah, before. And those of you listening, this is critical to you. Now, Donald Trump all of a sudden wants to go back and remember this. He ran on the first thing he was going to do on day one was to repeal Obamacare. On day one, he tried to sign an executive order to repeal the ACA. He signed on to a lawsuit to repeal the ACA, but lost at the Supreme Court. And he would have repealed the ACA had it not been for the courage of John McCain to save that bill.
And we should say ACA is also short for Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. He's sort of using these terms interchangeably. But I don't know, that to me was interesting that he was sort of trying to, push back. And do you think he was effective in trying to undermine what Vance was saying about Obamacare?
I mean, there's no question that Trump tried very hard to get rid of Obamacare. That's what he ran on in 2016, back in a time when Obamacare was, a huge boogeyman on the right. And, in the elections before that, it proved a very fruitful issue for Republicans to run against the Affordable Care Act. It is another example, I would say, of Trump's commentary on these issues kind of running into the political realities of the day. You know, Trump not long ago was making comments about getting rid of Obamacare again. This was just, last year, I believe it was. And so here's his running mate up on stage talking about the virtues of Obamacare and playing up the idea that Trump actually saved it. I think it's a very difficult argument to make.
Aaron, any other big moments from this debate?
I think one of the ones that really stood out to me was towards the end of the debate when Walz started to get his footing a little bit more. And a big reason for that was that the debate turned to issues that were pretty friendly for Democrats, namely January 6th. And here's an exchange in which Walz was really pressing J.D. Vance on whether Donald Trump actually lost the 2020 election.
This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship.
This came after J.D. Vance had talked about the importance of respecting election results, and he had pointed to the idea that Democrats in 2016 had questioned the legitimacy of Trump's win. Now, of course, Democrats did not storm the Capitol. They didn't actually seriously contest Donald Trump taking office, which is a stark contrast to 2020. But I thought this was a moment where Walz really kind of drove home how extreme the Republican ticket is on these issues. Like, lots of Republicans deny the results of the 2020 election, but it's a 60-40 issue, 65-35 issue that Americans regard those election results as being legitimate. And so this was one moment where he kind of pointed to how far out there the Republican ticket is, because Donald Trump insists on holding this position and still contests that election result to this day.
Mm-hmm. So, Aaron, I think a lot of people after they watch a debate ask themselves two questions. One, who won the debate? And two, does it matter? So I guess I would ask you first, who won this debate?
I think it's probably more of a positive for J.D. Vance, in large part because he had more work to do. You know, he's not a very popular running mate. And so he had more work to do as far as getting himself in a better political position. As far as whether this ultimately changes a whole lot, I'm skeptical that people vote on vice presidential nominees a whole lot in the first place. And because this debate was relatively low key, I think it's probably something that fades in the memory in the days and weeks to come. But, you know, if J.D. Vance can successfully recast the Republican ticket, or at least his portion of it, into being kind of a more mainstream way, which very much is to be determined because both he and Trump have taken some pretty extreme positions. You know, if he can do that, then he'll have done his ticket a service in this debate.
Yeah, and maybe this was sort of like a way to test that out tonight.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, certainly you talk to different audiences when you're on a debate stage versus at a rally. That's certainly the case with Donald Trump. I wouldn't expect that the Trump campaign would suddenly change its stripes. You know, Trump has never done that, despite lots of talk constantly about whether he will. But at least on this stage, there was a little bit of a different emphasis for the ticket.
Well, Aaron, that's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for taking the extra time to record this after the debate. It has been quite a late night.
It has been. Thank you, Elahe. And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter.
You can find a link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com. That's it for this episode of the Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, the Campaign Moment will not be back in your feeds until next week. So if you want to hear our Friday episode of the Campaign Moment, you'll need to head over to the Campaign Moment show feed itself. And while you're there, make sure to subscribe.
Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy, and it was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
I'm Elahe Izadi.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
See you next time, Aaron.
Bye, Elahe.
So, Aaron, I want to pick up the playlist.
Oh my gosh, here we go. I should have never told people about my music tastes.
Well, if I see you in the gym, I'm going to keep my distance because I feel like you need to be in your moment, and I don't know where you're going to take your aggression out. And I hope it's on some dumbbells.
I promise I'll be nicer to you than a rap beef between East and West.